Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. It's been a challenging year. A global pandemic, violent unrest in the streets of major American cities, and a divisive presidential election have all challenged us in different ways, testing the strength of civil society and institutions at both the local and national level. Throughout the year, Acton's president and co-founder, Rev Robert Sirico, has offered commentary on these events as they unfolded. Now, at the end of the year, I spoke with Rev Sirico to get his reflections on the year as it comes to a close, to see how we handled the unique trials we encountered in our public life in 2020, and how the principles articulated by the Acton Institute guided us through these trying times and will continue to provide a mechanism for gaining understanding and perspective on our world in 2021. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. I'm joined now by Rev Robert Sirico, who is the president and co-founder of the Acton Institute. Father Sirico, thanks so much for joining us on this episode.
Well, of course. Thank you very much for having me.
So 2020 has been quite a year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I hadn't noticed.
A master of understatement that I am there.
We could just, for a moment, I've been reflecting on people, who are doing an interview like this or writing a letter or a fundraiser. And it always starts with the genuflection to this year, which is appropriate enough, but it's becoming rather redundant.
You're not wrong about that. It's the thing I first tired of was in commercials, in these troubled times, which began every commercial for...
Or the other phrase that'll probably make the books this year is with a preeminence of precaution, or how does that go?
An abundance of caution, I think. Yes.
An abundance of caution. That's it.
I enjoyed it in the commercial sense as it became increasingly detached from what they were trying to attach it to, which is, in these troubled times, I need a Toyota.
Right.
I guess.
Erectile dysfunction commercials in these troubled times. And it sounds like a movie promo,
Far less, well, I don't know. Given how much people have been locked inside, I don't know. That may be more connected than the Toyota.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way.
No, that's okay. It's okay. It becomes so rote, you don't even realize you're doing it anymore.
It's true. It's true, isn't it?
So... everything was disrupted really back in March when this pandemic really hit this country. And you offered some thoughts and commentary as this pandemic evolved forward over the first several months of it. I'm curious, looking back at your thoughts at the time, now that we're at the end of the year, now that we're at a time when the vaccine for the coronavirus is being distributed, which looks to be the best gateway we have to getting back to some semblance of normality. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the year and what we've learned from the experience we all had with this pandemic we didn't really see coming.
Well, I do think this is a good stopping point to kind of collect our understanding of what's happening. But let me say right now that I don't think we are through this. This is too rich an opportunity for people who want to build dependency upon the state to let it just go. And they haven't even voted, as we're recording this now, on the next stimulus bill. So I think there's going to be a continuation of, at the very least, the economic consequences of this going into the next generation or generations. And I think also the regulatory apparatus, because, and this is perhaps the most disconcerting thing, because if there's any one thing we've learned from our whole experience right from the beginning, It's that the state has hampered the knowledge, the confusion about what a pandemic is, what it means, how to protect ourselves from it, how to plan for it, how to intelligently protect the populace. If there's anything we've learned, it's that the state has hampered this in terms of the regulations. And you mentioned the vaccines, which are now just being shipped from, by the way, Michigan, within a few miles of where I'm sitting, produced by private companies, but having to get the kind of regulatory permissions which would have been available probably much sooner. Because let's remember that the companies themselves that are producing these vaccines are the ones most interested in their effectiveness. So the bureaucrats are just adding layer upon layer of regulation. And I think if there's anything to be credited to the Trump administration is that he was a bull in the china shop about this. He harangued people until this stuff was produced and got through the bureaucratic morass. So I think those kinds of things that I was talking about at the beginning have only kind of come into full technicolor now, if you will.
There was a fascinating piece in New York Magazine several days ago that talked about how the Moderna vaccine was developed really over a weekend. It took them 2 days to develop the vaccine, and it was ready to be manufactured on January 13th, which is before we even had a death in this country that was accredited to the COVID-19 virus.
Right.
And the entire remaining period of time is what they have to run through in terms of testing and meeting the qualifications from the FDA in order to release it. I think one of the things that's going to be interesting to look back on is the dynamism in the private sector there to create this in such an incredibly fast timeline so that we had the tools we needed all along, and how that process gets slowed down when it comes into collision with the state.
This needs to be amplified because this could be one of the kind of inverse crisis in Leviathan. This was the theme of some of what I said, referencing Robert Higgs's book, that when you have a crisis, you have a Leviathan response to it, and it never quite goes back to where it was the first time. This may be a reverse effect, that if we can amplify what you just said, how quickly it was developed. Of course, we want to have all of the necessary testing and the precaution, all of the rest of that done. The pretense is that the state has some efficacious role in this. And I think other than a maintenance of a legal apparatus to ensure that people are responsible for what they produce and that it is what they say it is, and to ensure that, I think it's that bureaucrats have to protect their little part of the pie, and they have to please supervisors who are always very resistant to change. It's the antithesis of the entrepreneurial spirit, which is willing to, take some chances and risk.
The bureaucrat who holds back a life-saving development at the FDA, no one knows that person's name, but the person who greenlights something like thalidomide, that's the person that gets hauled before Congress.
Exactly. So in terms of, in retrospect of those things, I think that would be those episodes that I did. I think a lot of that lesson about the state being opaque, about it being moribund. I think those are things that, as I look back on them, sound pretty good from this perspective.
Let's turn our attention now to the church. So we've seen a lot of litigation this year. The church was certainly subjected to, churches everywhere, to the same kind of restrictions that businesses saw, that any places of public gatherings saw. We've seen some vindications in recent days. The diocese in Brooklyn, which brought suit in New York, that was taken all the way to the Supreme Court, and the restrictions in place in New York were struck down as a result of that.
Yes.
As you look back, how do you think the church handled the circumstance that they were, or churches in general, or speak to however you want, the circumstances that they were forced into with the restrictions that were placed on them in a way that seemed to suggest that they aren't considered essential services in the way that I think we understand them to be?
Well, I think what's obvious now is that the secularist bias in the political sphere was made manifest in that they would allow, sometimes next door to each other, strip clubs to function, and churches had to close with the bias in terms of the application of the law. Again, the question is, who really cares more about the constituencies, politicians or pastors? I think the response on the part of the religious community, because we have to speak here now in a very ecumenical context, has been various. A number of the Protestant evangelical churches have been good. Some have been irresponsible, I would say, where they just want to disregard it and pray it away. But a number of the evangelical churches have brought these points, the unfairness, the inequality, and the necessity of having services that provide for more than just the physical care of people. I mean, we're seeing this now, too, with reports on suicide and depression and domestic violence and the like. And the church plays an indispensable role in ameliorating so much of that. So I think the evangelical churches have largely done well. The Orthodox Jewish community has responded marvelously and heroically, I think, and were persecuted for it. In all places, New York, where you'd think that a mayor would be a little more sensitive, even on top of being caught in his own hypocrisy. That was one of the points that I made during the course of the events. And you've rightly pointed out someone like Bishop DiMarzio in Brooklyn and also Cordileone in San Francisco. These are two heroic bishops, among several others. But I have to say, in my own estimation, the Catholic Bishops' Conference has been anemic and weak in their response, almost reluctant to say anything that would contradict the various, agencies that were controlling this thing. And what a powerful force the Bishops' Conference could have been had it taken this thing on more directly. Again, responsibly. I'm not just saying to be defiant for the sake of being defiant, but to say, look, we have a handle on this. We know we'll consult with our doctors, and then we will proceed in the best way we think. But we've gone without Easter, which was very traumatic for a lot of reasons within the Catholic world, because this is the time where we receive people into the church and all that. And then now we're facing a similar thing with Christmas, although I think we're all a little wiser now about all of this.
The secular bias in the way the state has approached this that you have mentioned, that stuck out to me with you raising the issues that we have seen with rise in people who have reported that they've considered suicide, the loss of life to suicide, things like domestic violence. Have we just, is the state engaging in that kind of secular bias? Do they just disregard the real nature of us as human beings that need to be social with each other, that have needs beyond just the simple things that they think that they can provide to us with a check or special permissions to go to the grocery store?
I honestly don't think they even think about it. I mean, a lot of these people are not churchgoers. They've so acclimated to a sanitized public square that reference to the transcendent, to God, to spirituality just doesn't exist, and is actually considered impolite when it's mentioned. So I just don't think it's in their consciousness. And especially when you have this kind of hegemonic professionalism, that is a very narrow professionalism that is concerned only, for instance, in medicine, only with the person as patient and not as a person. It's the old adage, I think I've referred to it before somewhere, that to a hammer, everything is a nail. And so in the political sphere, it's weighing how this is going to affect the vote, or how we can allocate these resources. So I think that's largely the problem. It fails to see the full depth of community for having seen it only through a political lens. By the way, I think that the politicians, and this isn't a conversation that I've heard raised yet, but I would predict in about 6 or 8 months, maybe toward the end of next year, this will come up. And that is the lessening flow of revenue from having closed down all these businesses. Who's going to pay for all of this? I mean, it's not just that you closed the businesses, you closed your tax base. Mm-hmm. And how are we going to make up for that? So I that's why I say I don't think this thing is over at all. I mean, we still have the, $14 trillion worth of debt, trillion, and they're still talking about cooking up some more, when what they could have done was have pronounced a tax holiday from the beginning.
With what you mentioned there about that, you don't think politicians, bureaucrats consider the full nature of the human person as all and at all in their considerations, and their actions do seem to suggest that. I think this is also underscored by something else you mentioned, which was the hypocrisy that we're seeing from people who are in positions of leadership. And perhaps the most stark example and striking example of this is the mayor of Austin, Texas, advising people to stay home, to not travel, recording that message on a Zoom call
on his way to the airport.
Well, from Cabo San Lucas, which is, do you think as a result of what we've witnessed basically from...
There's no shame.
And there doesn't seem to be a lot in a lot of these political leaders, because we replete with examples of other people saying one thing and doing another, telling the public to do one thing and then doing another themselves.
Sure.
Do you think...
it started with Madonna lamenting the isolation of people as she sat in a rose floating tub. And then, of course, the Kardashians from exotic locations pronouncing on the sadness of this. But from politicians, this is really galling.
It is. Do you think that this, combined with the experience people have had, will lead to people demanding better? We seem to live in a very cynical time right now where people just expect this of politicians. Do you think the kind of justified anger that people will feel over the way that life has been lived for the last 9 months, combined with these political leaders' desire and willingness to flout it, will change what they're demanding of leaders at all?
It will not happen unless people are... unless connections are made for people. That is, people can have a lot of emotion about a thing, and the direction that energy takes depends on how they see the things, how coherent their own philosophy, or how they see society structured. If they see it, and this is a concern that I have, I think there's a great deal of complexity. I want to encourage a certain amount of suspicion of government involvement. But that's not to say that I don't believe in government. It's not to say that I don't believe in the civic order, much less the social order. And my fear is that a lot of people grow so frustrated that the suspicion they have of government becomes cynicism of social relations as a whole. And when you have that breakdown of an ethos, of a belief in a society that can be free and can be prosperous and can be life engendering, where communities support one another, where neighbors act as neighbors to those who are in need. When that all breaks down, and I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now, this gets dangerous. We should not in any way hesitate to criticize the obtuseness of bureaucrats and government planning and the way in which it has this pretense to knowing what's really going on. We shouldn't hesitate to say all of that, but we need to say it at the same time that we're pointing to the way in which people relate to one another as neighbors when they're allowed to, when they're not hindered by regulations, excessive taxation, various kinds of zoning laws, restrictions on religious liberty and other community events. These things have to go together, or you end up having this kind of cynical chaos that we're seeing around us.
Maybe what we can hope for is that this kind of hypocrisy, the experience we've had, seems to me the kind of thing that will only continue to erode our faith in institutions as they exist now, but that our reaction to that, this would be the hopeful take, our reaction to that is to not kind of roll our eyes and grow cynical, as I think as a society we've done for a number of the most recent years, but instead do what traditionally we have done in those circumstances where we lose faith in institutions, which is build new ones.
Yes.
Get together and find ways to build new institutions to solve the problems when we realize that the old institutions weren't addressing them anymore.
Well, yes, and that's going to take a while to do. The advantage we have is that we have this new means of communicating. And just in the last year, of course, as an institution, the Acton Institute, which is largely dependent on conferences of various sizes and various kinds and locations, we've had, like everybody else, have had to kind of adapt ourselves to various other alternatives. So what gives me some hope is that while we have to do this work of rebuilding institutions and understanding what makes for that to happen, we do have a technology that enables us to do that at a level and a speed that we've never had before in history.
Before we get back to this episode of Acton Line, I want to take a moment to tell you about our newest podcast, Acton Institute Events. The Acton Institute's international events include public lectures, academic seminars, joint participation in panels, the annual Acton University Conference, the Institute's annual dinner, and more, all focused on illustrating our vision of a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. Previous event speakers have included Acton's own Rev Robert Sirico, Samuel Gregg, and Michael Matheson Miller. Other speakers have included P.J. O'Rourke, Yuval Levin, Anthony Bradley, Arthur Brooks, Jonah Goldberg, Stephanie Slade, Bradley Berzer, Ann Rathbone Bradley, and many others. To subscribe to the Acton Institute Events podcast, look for a link in the show notes for this episode of Acton Line, or just search Acton Institute Events on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Now, back to the show. Let's let the pandemic, we can't really move past it, so let's just let it recede a bit into the background to address a couple other issues from the year.
Okay.
There are two things that stand out to me. The civil unrest and the rioting that we saw earlier this year, and civil unrest and some rioting that we're seeing now in the aftermath of the election. Rather than dwell on those two particular instances themselves, perhaps it would be better to address. It seems that we are a nation and a world, to a great extent too, in need of some healing and some ways to come together. How do we go about beginning that process?
Well, these are unsettling currents that we see. I mean, the confusion over politics, the racial tensions, these are unsettling things, and they disrupt society. And I think largely this happens when we forget human nature. I mean, when we forget the dignity of the human person. Where do our rights come from? You know, our rights don't come from government. Our rights come from our nature. And I think these are issues that need to be retrieved, understood once more. And so much of the sectors of society that were the guardians of that, the articulators of that vision of human dignity, of transcendence and the rest, have been weakened from within because of a lack of confidence in their own beliefs, and weakened, as we've already discussed, politically, institutionally, by the kinds of regulations that have made life more difficult. So we really need to return to these things and acknowledge the problems that exist. It seems to me, now maybe it's just me, I've just always been a curious person. I mean, if you went through my library and I wasn't in the room, I'll bet you that you wouldn't know where I was coming from politically. You'd know I have a heavy interest in certain areas, you know, theology or economics and stuff. But in terms of the books that are there, I mean, there's an incredible diversity of these ideas. And I think that curiosity that I have has always prompted me to want to listen to people that I disagree with, and not listen in a kind of passive way, but in a curious way and in a respectful way, and so respectful that I'm willing to disagree and say it. And I think we've lost that curiosity. Here's the trait of the modern moment politically, is we want to shut people up. We don't want to listen to them. We want to articulate our facts. And then when we're done and you go to say something about them, we want to say them again and say them again and again and again, and to shut you up. And I think you're seeing that on the streets. I think you're seeing that in the halls of Congress. People no longer want to engage the idea. It's what's been called the cancel culture. So we don't allow any permission for people, really tolerance, for people to disagree with things. And then, especially when you have this robust faith in the power of government, you want to institute that by law. So you make things and speech and even thoughts illegal and prosecutable. And I think that's that augurs the worst for society.
Something I've thought more about recently in the context of those ideas that those thoughts that can't be shared, that can't be spoken. As I read back through history, you look at a lot of truly brilliant people who changed the world for the better, who were incredible creative minds and inventors and entrepreneurs, who also had some really wild ideas. You know, Thomas Edison's drive to create a lot of the things he invented was because he wanted to commune with the dead.
Right.
The kinds of things that we would look at now and say, this is too eccentric for us. We don't want someone expressing these ideas that we view as uncouth. And we spent, it seems we spent a good portion of each year talking about, you've raised the Kardashians, I'll now raise Kanye West, that Kanye West says some crazy things and he also makes some amazing music. And I don't think you get the two without each other. And to bring it back to the point of the human person, seem to want to get rid of certain things in our human nature that we just don't like, rather than being somewhat accepting of the things that make us uncomfortable and trying to understand who we really are as individual people.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't know who the Kardashians were until about a year ago. And I still really don't know who they are. And what little I've seen, I don't want to know any more about. And Kanye West, I was asked to be on national television to comment on him. And I didn't want to pass up the opportunity to be on, TV for, get our ideas out. But I had to do a research on him. And I think this Kanye West is a very interesting character. And he's got a lot of bizarre ideas, but he's got a lot of pretty good ideas. And as to his music, I don't know. I'm agnostic on the music. It's not my generation of music. But it kind of reminds me of my home growing up. I mean, there were lots of viewpoints being expressed. And, if you took snippets of it, you could make us very harsh and uncaring people. But I lived in the middle of that in 3 dimensions. And was it dysfunctional? Absolutely. But was it hateful? No. Even if some of the language back in the 50s that was used, which was much more acceptable then, to my mind, and even as growing up, I didn't like it. But I see the whole context of people. The Archie Bunker character of the 1970s was a lovable character because there was something in him that was worthy of respect, even if he was the dumbest guy on the block.
Well, he was the guy who was working multiple jobs in order to provide for his family, making sacrifices in ways that we don't seem to lionize as much anymore. And that is one of those great examples of the character that the creator thought would be the beloved character of the show was not the beloved character of the show, as the storytelling kind of took its own life as people viewed it, and people sympathized, even if they may have disliked some of Archie Bunker's views on certain things.
Surely.
They empathized with the character in a way that I don't think they were expecting to.
And I think the reason, the difference today is that we cancel all that out, that we don't see any of that. We only see this one dimension of it. I mean, I remember once I was at an evangelical meeting, and I was in the collar, a Catholic priest, and somebody from a distance was talking to a friend of mine. And I saw that I presume they were talking about me, just kind of the gestures and the looks. And when my friend came back over, I said, what did that guy say? He said, oh, nothing. I said, no, I'm just curious. He said, no, I don't want to mention it. I could see it was an awkward situation. I said, come on, just tell me, I'm curious. He said, well, he asked me if you knew Jesus. And he thought I'd be just terribly offended by that. And I said, go back and tell him not only do I know Jesus, but I know his mother as well. I guess what I'm saying by that is I wanted to engage the guy. And I know people today get very offended when they say, well, he wants to convert me. I welcome Jehovah's Witnesses to come to my door, or Mormons to have a conversation if they'll have a good conversation about it. And so I know the chances are we're going to walk away disagreeing with each other, but I'm going to come away a little more informed, at least on that person's perspective, that person's life. And I think we're losing this sense of liberality. That's really what I'm talking about, an authentic liberalism.
Let's move to one last thing. So we've discussed a lot of what have been the difficulties of 2020. Let's look forward. As you reflect on the year that we've experienced, what are you most hopeful about for this next year?
Well, again, it's not going to happen by itself. The thing I'm most hopeful for will only happen if people who have an understanding of what's going on or what has gone on can make a compelling case for it. And it is this. In theology, we call it the via negativa, the negative way of learning a truth. And I think we have a rich opportunity to engage the via negativa. That is to see what went wrong and how we can learn from what went wrong. But the reason I want to underscore the necessity of having a coherent vision of society is because we can just have the via negativa and become negative ourselves. We need to kind of approach this with an understanding of what makes society cohere. How do people collaborate, work with one another, challenge one another? How can we go about doing that? And that, I think, is based on, the very things that we talk so much about at the Acton Institute, a proper view of the human person, anthropology, and building on that, a proper view of society and the family and law and economy. All of these things need to kind of come together, but it's all rooted in the necessity of a person to have freedom, to engage his or her mind, his intellect in engaging the world, the material world, the necessity of freedom because of our transcendence and our dignity.
To put that idea of the via negativa in another philosopher's words, Edmund Burke, example is the school of mankind, and he shall learn at no other. And we have a lot of examples that we can learn from, and hopefully we do take those lessons that we and the people take them in consideration of the principles that the Acton Institute articulates and applies them to our lives going forward. I think we can all be hopeful for that.
Yes, well, I can say this, and for our friends who are listening to this, we have not lost 1 ounce of confidence in our ideas or enthusiasm in letting people know about these ideas. So I just ask you, join your energy to ours. Be part of this growing constituency. Our programs actually under this circumstance have expanded. So please get on board. It's going to be a fun trip going ahead, especially when we can be with each other again personally.
Hopefully that will be soon. Rev Robert Sirico is the president and co-founder of the Acton Institute. Father, thanks so much for joining us for this episode. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
God bless. Merry Christmas and a very blessed, safe, and prosperous New Year.
As always, thank you so much for listening today. Our team loves putting this show together for you every week, and it's so encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can reach our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.